Good afternoon, everybody. So, we're going to go ahead and continue our lecture and continue on this idea of understanding institutions, specifically with how to rethink them. So, today we're taking a look at rethinking institutions with Gloria Anzaldúa. So, quick review to kind of orient ourselves in what we're going to talk about today. So, again, we've talked about the last two lessons. Institutions are places that we find ourselves every day. There are physical, non-physical spaces that are influential to who we become. And I think this final part here that we've really been emphasizing, in some ways, they form the borders of our personality and outline our identities, right? So the big question that we had leading up to this lecture was this idea of being trapped. So if these are relationships, if institutions form the very boundaries of our relationships, is there any way to escape out of them? Is there any way to define who we are and what our relationships look like and avoid being controlled, or this feeling of this idea of feeling trapped by the institutions themselves? We talked a bit about it last lecture as a part of talking about the education system. And previously then, within our review of the education system, we talked a lot about the teacher and student relationship. So previously, this teacher-student relationship was something that was troubling because it ended up recreating these relations of one person being more valuable than the other. Teachers on top, students on the bottom, right? Whereas with Paulo Freire, he helped us rethink this relationship and modify it as something that was more circular. That everybody was a teacher-student, TS here, everybody was a teacher-student. And people would learn and teach each other based on what they brought to the table. Okay? So one of the main things Freire did was look at the classroom. So we were looking at physical spaces. We were looking at physical spaces and how they changed how we related with each other. So one way to modify institutions in this sense was to change what the classroom looked like. Rather than having the teacher up front, we have everyone sitting in a circle. We change the shape of the physical space, which then changes the relationship itself. Okay? So we're going to take a look then at the other end of this perspective. Take a look at Gloria Anzaldúa, and she's going to give us an idea of new ways of understanding ourselves in order to change this relationship. And she specifically does this, for those of us who are interested in these things, art and history. She's saying through art, through creative things, and understanding our own history, we could rethink who we are. Okay? So we could recontextualize who we are. So the two things we're looking at here, physical space, if we think back about the baggage of what we bring with ourselves to a relationship, the physical space can modify how we relate with others. And in this case, the non-physical, what we've talked about before, and we'll go into more detail here, ideological. Non-physical or ideological space can also shift what sorts of context or what baggage we bring with us into a relationship. Okay? So if this seems unclear now, we're going to go into details throughout the whole lecture. So as a review, this is going back to one of our early lectures where we're talking about becoming. And specifically, if you recall, we talked about Martin Buber. Key name here, Martin Buber. And the respect for relationships. So in sociology, we've talked a lot about how, I'll be drawing this a lot, these are two people relating with each other. I might bring something in with me, and the other person might also bring something in with them. But Buber's whole thing is that you need both of these. That the key feature of any relationship is this part right here, the interaction. This actually makes something completely new. So Buber's whole idea was that I literally cannot exist without the other person. So there's a deep level of respect. So the I-thou relationship implies something that is respectful, something that is meaningful, and something that is necessary. Meaning that we cannot get away from the other people in our lives and how that makes us who we are. This is all integral aspects. 1, 2, 3. Respectful, meaningful, and necessary. And if we related with that, Buber's idea was this idea of becoming. That because we are in relation with each other, this relationship itself changes over time. This I am, who I am, changes in our context. And we can think of context as family context, what family we came from, our economic context, who our friends are, what school we go to, what community we live in. This constantly changes the I am. So dynamic, who I am, is changeable depending on who I'm with. Like if your parents has ever warned you, this idea of your friends are making you into someone who is different than who you are. It's because we're constantly changing with other people. So this is Buber's idea, and we'll also see this is also Anzaldua's. Whereas the old idea, another idea, is being is something that's constant. If you could stand by yourself and you don't need anybody else in our life. You as the individual is always an I am, always stays the same, never changing. So in sociology, we're interested more in Buber's idea, because this emphasizes the importance of relationships, right? So part of what we were wondering at the end of that lecture was, okay, so if who we are is important, who we are with other people is important to who we become, then how do we go about doing that? How do we go ahead and change that? How do we focus more on this I-thou relationship and get that sort of respect? So Anzaldua then offers us a way of doing that. So Anzaldua, who exactly was she? We'll take a look at some of her artwork or her work in just a little bit. So Gloria Anzaldua, she was an academic activist, and I do a slash there because she was just as much about publishing books, being a professor, and teaching people as she was about trying to change society itself. So she wasn't focused on just being a publisher or being an important teacher, but she wanted to actually change society. Okay? So one of the main things she mostly focused on queer identity, Latina identity, connecting ideas of colonization and white supremacy. We're not going to go to too much detail on those parts of her writing, but it was important to know that she has done all of that. Okay? And as a writer, she used poetry, personal biography, family history, world history, all to tell a story. So we'll take a look at her writing in a little bit, but if you're used to reading a book, especially in class, usually it looks one way. It's usually in English. It's usually written in a third-person view. It's detached. And importantly, really, it's just non-personal, right? And if you've ever written a paper for a class and gotten points taken away because you're using I, or you're talking about yourself, this is traditionally what academic work looks like. However, Anzaldua wanted to get rid of all of that idea. And her idea was saying that, how can I really tell a true story about myself if I'm limited in the ways I could do so? So she would challenge a lot of these different things. and would actually be bilingual, so it wasn't all in English. She would use poetry. She would talk about herself, and she would talk about family history. All because, like we've been saying, a story about herself, about herself can't be done without telling the story of everybody, especially everyone in her community. At the same time, though, if you're writing a history about everyone, you also can't do it without telling a story about yourself. So her work, and I'll give some excerpts of it, and if you're ever interested, you could check out her book, La Frontera, or Borderlands, to see how she does this, where her history of her people, her history of her local community or family, and herself are all woven together in one big work that shows how separating oneself from the other, how these things are inseparable. So she actually does this. So she, Anzaldúa, is doing what Buber was actually only dreaming about. Anzaldúa actually produces work that is all of these things. So let's actually take a quick look at what this looks like. So over here on the left, we have Gloria Anzaldúa's Borderlands, the new Mestiza. And here's what the textbook looks like. Here's the cover. And I'll have some excerpts of this reading for you to take a look at on Canvas below. But this is the very first page. I wanted to show you this, and I will, if we were doing this in person, I would have someone else read this, but I will try my best. But at the very opening, she has poetry that opens up her book. So I'm going to read some excerpts of it. So this is about the border. So let us take a look at these ones. I'm going to point at a few of these. So for instance here, Miro el mar atacar la cerca en Borderfield Park con sus bucones de agua, and Easter Sunday resurrection of the brown blood in my veins. Continues to go down. Beneath the iron sky, Mexican children kick their soccer balls across, run after entering the U.S. I press my hand to the steel curtain, chain link fence with rolled barbed wire, rippling from the sea where Tijuana touches San Diego and rolling over mountain plains and deserts. The tortilla curtain turning to Rio Grande, flowing down to the flatlands of the magical valley of South Texas, its mouth emptying into the Gulf. 1,950-mile-long open wound, dividing a pueblo, a culture running down the length of my body, snaking fence rods in my flesh, splits me, viraja, viraja. So just this final sections here. This is my home, this thin barbed edge of barbed wire. But the skin of the earth is seamless, the sea cannot be fenced. El mar does not stop at borders to show the white man what she thought of his arrogance. Yamaha blew that wire fence down. This was Mexican once, this was Indian always, and is, and will be again. So it goes right into that to go into the section where she speaks in Spanish and then opens it up with her history of the U.S.-Mexican border. She starts off broadly, and as she continues down into the actual body of the book, Anzaldúa goes through and brings in history of her family, talks about how their family lost land, talks about how she's lose personal space as an individual in the world, and connects all these things together, get a full story that really captures this idea of borderlands, or who she is, where her people come from, and where she comes from. Okay? So what does this mean? So part of Anzaldúa's technique is creating history. So basically what her technique then does is to show she could draw from creative processes to tell her own history in some way to construct herself. She, of course, like I'd mentioned, she used other techniques like talking about her family history and deeper histories of her family background to construct who she is in relation to other people. So importantly, as we were talking about, like Buber, she believed that a person becomes themselves in relation with other people. So quite literally for her, her story. She can't take that away from her family's story. And she can't separate that from the broader history of her people, her culture. These are all a part of who she is. And she weaves all these things together to be able to construct a bigger history. And she does this largely in conflict with traditional history. And there's a phrase that often comes up when I talk about this in classes, is often history is told from the perspective of the winner, right? So her perspective here counters traditional history, and generally traditional history is one perspective. It's supposed to be objective, and is supposed to be the truth with a capital T. Meaning that there aren't multiple stories here. There's only one story, right? So in U.S. history, this traditionally has meant wealthy white male perspectives, or people in power. So part of her project here is also to counteract power itself. So the power of traditional history reinforces the power of wealthy white male perspectives. However, by counteracting that and showing a different story, she's able to challenge power itself. So that is what her technique is intending to do. But it also, again, beckons back to how we could better understand, what we're bringing with ourselves, what we're packing with ourselves, what we're bringing with ourselves into other relationships. Okay. So one final thought, one final definition on how to talk about this is she talks about this whole technique, everything we've talked about so far. Let's actually go back and look at this picture right here. This perspective right here. This perspective of a single perspective of her story, family story, and cultural story is all one identity. So we'll look at that here. So if we look back at that image, so personal story, to family, to culture, this whole thing that encompasses all of these relationships, she has a name for that. She calls this whole idea of a mestiza identity. So she labels this idea then of a single individual is this. She's saying we aren't this single person by themselves. We're not this. We are this whole thing. Each individual is their personal story, their family story, their cultural story. This whole thing is the mestiza identity. So Gloria Anzaldúa notes this as the modern person, especially in the new culture where we're all mixed together, where different cultures mix together in a global economy with global social media reach. This new fully realized individual is the mestiza, or a person who exists between two worlds or multiple worlds. So we're not changing, we're not the same throughout our lives. We're actually, all these things have to be taken into context. Our environment shapes us, our histories shape us, our relationships shape us, as well as our social, political, and economic context. All these things make us who we are. And this is what this new identity is. And of course, so what does that mean? That means we have to be able to know all these things. As an individual, we have to know our history. We have to know things about our environment. We have to know about the family and friends in our lives. These things aren't a choice if we don't know these things. And we don't know ourselves as the individual. These things literally make us who we are. And part of what she says that we could do that is finding some creative way to find your own history and to find your family, friends, and to be able to identify these things. So that's what she does throughout the whole book, is writing poetry, engaging in creative work in order to write out who she is in relation to other people. So this is a quote here when she actually talks about, here's a poem about what a mestiza is, and I'm going to read it out loud. Pardon for the Spanish, but I think it's important to focus on this. Because I, a mestiza, continually walk out of one culture and into another, because I am in all cultures at the same time. Alma entre dos mundos, tres, cuatro, mi zumba la cabeza con lo contradictorio. Estoy norteado por todas las vocas que me hablan simultáneamente. So, what she's getting at here is that this single identity, specifically of her people, of her culture, but this could be said about any individual, we are the summation of our history and all the voices of the people around us. Okay. So what is the implications about this? What can we say about this? So first off, here's the implications in this section here. So now we can see the large part of our understanding of how we are in relationships is understanding who we are and what we bring to these relationships. So like I've already said, one of the main things we need to know is we need to know our background, our history, and where we're coming from. Big part of this. Second part of this is, part number 2, if we want to develop successful I-thou relationships, that is, respectful relationships, we understand who we are in relation to others, as well as who we are changes depending on who we are with. So this is a combination of what Buber and Anzaldúa were talking about. To get this successful I-thou relationship, we need to be able to know where we're coming from. Okay? So part of this process then is I want to jump into an activity where we're actively going to do this. So often for when I'm discussing Anzaldúa, to encourage us to take a look at a relationship that we have or at relationships that we have been in, to look more deeply at it in a way and narrate it. Okay, so before I read the body of this, I've had students do songs, I've had students do poems, and I've had students do pictures, write fictional stories. So it doesn't actually have to be true, it could be fictional or non-fiction stories. This doesn't have to be long. If it's a poem or a song, it may be less than a page. Maybe less than a page. It may be a few paragraphs. But the main idea is once you get at a relationship and talk creatively about your history, kind of like Anzaldúa did. So the main question is, as we've been doing throughout this term, is to think about a relationship in your life. And just try to narrate. Try to narrate it, narrate where you're coming from. Just narrate this relationship. Talk about, for instance, I might draw a picture. I'll do a quick one here on the side. If it was myself and my spouse, and I could just draw a creative picture that shows maybe the key things in our lives, the key things that are important to us. Like for us, we might draw our home. I might draw our cats. We have a pair of black cats. We might also draw some of the things that represent the struggles that we've been through. So we've been through economic struggles. We've had trouble finding jobs. And these things that we're bringing with us that make our relationship happen. So think about a relationship in your life and create something that depicts that relationship. Or it could be a poem, or it could be a song. So importantly here, like I want to mention too that this can be fictional. So if you don't feel comfortable writing about your own relationship, maybe think about American relationships in general. So think about depicting a relationship between siblings, between spouses, between family members or friends. So it doesn't have to be one that you've experienced yourself. And secondly, another important thing I want to emphasize is it would be great if you could share this creative project with your peers on our discussion board. However, if you're not comfortable with that, on the discussion board you could actually just do the second part and just reflect on how you felt about doing the project. So if I didn't want to share like a picture of the painting that I drew, I could just talk about it. So I could, rather than say describing it and showing it, I could just say drawing this picture of a relationship with my spouse made me feel more deeply and made me feel closer than ever in understanding how I relate with my spouse. So it could be a reflection on that as well.